There is a moment and it doesn't look dramatic. No shouting, no final argument, no grand exit, just silence. That's the moment everything changes for an empath, because for most of their life, an empath is conditioned to believe that connection equals survival. Their nervous system is wired to scan for emotional shifts, micro-expressions, tone changes, constantly reading the room like a threat detection system. This isn't personality. This is biology. Studies in neuroscience show that highly empathetic individuals often have heightened activity in mirror neuron systems, meaning they don't just understand emotions, they absorb them. And that's where the damage begins. Because when you absorb everyone else's emotional chaos, you slowly lose access to your own. So the empath adapts. They become the fixer, the listener, the one who understands everyone except themselves. And here's the dangerous part: the brain rewards this. Every time they soothe someone, avoid conflict, or sacrifice their own needs, they will be more likely to be able to help you. The brain releases small amounts of dopamine and oxytocin chemicals linked to bonding and reward. So now, people-pleasing isn't just a habit, it's an addiction. But addiction always comes with a crash. And for the empath, that crash looks like emotional exhaustion, chronic anxiety, and a deep, unshakable feeling of being unseen. This is the breaking point. The moment where the empath realizes something that most people never do. Not everyone deserves access to you, and peace is not something you find, it's something you protect. Now here's where the shift happens. Instead of asking, how do they feel? The empath starts asking, what is this costing me? That question rewires everything. Because now, the brain moves from emotional reactivity to cognitive awareness. This activates the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and self-control. And suddenly, the empath is no longer operating on emotional impulse. They're choosing silence over explanation, distance over drama, peace over people. And to others, it feels cold, but it's not cold. It's regulated. There's a psychological principle called emotional conservation. Your brain has limited energy. Every interaction, every emotional exchange consumes cognitive resources. When an empath is constantly surrounded by emotionally draining individuals, they can become drained themselves. Their mental bandwidth is depleted, leading to decision fatigue, irritability, and even physical symptoms like headaches and sleep disruption. So when they choose peace, they're not being selfish. They're restoring cognitive function. They're protecting their nervous system. They're healing. But here's the part no one talks about. This transition is uncomfortable because the empath has built their identity around being needed. So when they stop overgiving, they feel guilt. When they set boundaries, they feel fear. When they walk away, they feel like they're abandoning people. But that's not truth. That's conditioning. And conditioning can be broken. Here's how it starts in daily life. First, pause before responding. When someone brings you emotional chaos, don't react instantly. Give your brain time to process. Even a 3-second pause reduces emotional reactivity and increases rational control. Second, label what you feel. Not what they feel, what you feel. This activates language centers in the brain, which actually reduces emotional intensity. Instead of drowning in emotion, you begin to define it. And what you can define, you can control. Third, create controlled distance. Not every message needs a reply. Not every problem needs your involvement. Distance is not rejection, it's regulation. And finally, replace the habit, because you can't just stop people pleasing. You have to redirect that energy. Invest it in solitude, in self-awareness, in environments that don't demand emotional labor just to exist. Because here's the truth most people will never accept. The empath doesn't lose people when they choose peace. They lose chaos. And what replaces it is clarity, emotional stability, stronger decision-making, better relationships built on respect, not dependency. And most importantly, they finally meet themselves. Not the version shaped by others' expectations, but the version that exists without pressure, without noise, without constant emotional interference. That's the moment an empath becomes powerful. There's a moment so subtle that most people miss it, but for an empath, it feels like the ground beneath their identity is shifting. It begins with a question they were never trained to ask. Not how can I help, not how do they feel, but something far more dangerous: what is this costing me? That single question interrupts a lifelong pattern. Because until that moment, the empath has been operating on autopilot, driven by a nervous system that treats other people's emotions as urgent signals. And science confirms this isn't imagined. Highly empathetic individuals show increased activation in brain regions associated with emotional mirroring, meaning when someone near them feels stress, their brain fires as if they are under threat, not metaphorically, physiologically. Heart rate changes, cortisol rises. The body prepares for stress, even when the danger isn't theirs. Now imagine living like that every day, absorbing tension that doesn't belong to you, carrying emotional weight that was never yours to begin with. At first, it feels like connection. Then it becomes obligation. And eventually, it becomes exhaustion. This is where the pattern locks in. Because every time the empath steps in to fix, soothe, or stabilize someone else, the brain rewards that behavior. Dopamine reinforces the action. Oxytocin deepens the bond. And just like that, self-sacrifice becomes chemically addictive. The empath isn't just being kind, they're being conditioned. But here's the part no one warns them about. The brain doesn't differentiate between helping and harming when the reward system is activated. So even when the empath is drained, disrespected, or emotionally overwhelmed, their brain still whispers, "Do it again." And they do. Until one day, something doesn't feel right. The emotional fatigue doesn't go away. The anxiety lingers longer than usual. The need to withdraw becomes stronger than the need to connect. This is not weakness. This is neurological overload. Studies show that chronic emotional stress without recovery can shrink the brain's capacity for regulation, specifically impacting the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for decision-making and self-control. At the same time, the amygdala of the brain's fear center becomes more reactive. So now, the empath is trapped in a loop, overfeeling, overgiving, overreacting, and slowly losing control, until that question surfaces again: what is this costing me? This is the interruption, the moment the autopilot glitches. Because that question forces the brain to do something it hasn't done in a long time: evaluate, not emotionally, logically. And when logic enters the system, everything changes. The prefrontal cortex activates, impulse slows down, awareness expands, and for the first time, the empath sees the pattern instead of living inside it. They start noticing things they couldn't see before. How certain conversations leave them drained for hours. How some people only reach out when they need something. How their own needs have been consistently postponed, ignored, or silenced. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because awareness doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels painful. It feels like betrayal. Not from others, but from themselves. Realizing how much they've given away. How often they've said yes when they meant no. How deeply they've abandoned their own boundaries to maintain connection. This is the cost, and once it's seen, it can't be unseen. Now the brain faces a choice: return to the familiar pattern or endure the discomfort of change. And make no mistake, change feels threatening, because the empath's identity has been built around being needed. So when they hesitate to help, when they pause instead of reacting, when they choose silence over engagement, their brain interprets it as danger. Heart rate spikes, guilt floods in. Thoughts like "I'm being selfish," or "what if they leave," begin to surface. This isn't truth. This is withdrawal. The same way the body reacts when breaking any conditioned behavior. But here's the breakthrough. If the empath can stay in that pause just a few seconds longer than usual, they begin to reclaim control. Research shows that even a brief interruption between stimulus and response reduces emotional reactivity and strengthens cognitive regulation. In simple terms, the pause is power, and in that pause, a new pattern begins to form. Instead of absorbing someone's stress instantly, they observe it. Instead of fixing the problem, they question their role in it. Instead of saying yes automatically, they consider the impact. And slowly, something remarkable happens. The emotional intensity starts to decrease. Not because the world has changed, but because their brain has. Neural pathways that once reinforced overgiving begin to weaken. New pathways centered on self-awareness and control start to strengthen. This is neuroplasticity in action. The brain rewiring itself based on new choices. And with each repeated pause, each conscious decision, each moment of self-consideration, the empath becomes less reactive and more intentional. But the real transformation isn't just in behavior, it's in perception. They no longer see emotional chaos as something they must fix. They see it as something they can choose to engage with or not. That distinction changes everything. Because now, empathy is no longer a vulnerability. It becomes a filter, a tool, a controlled response instead of an automatic reaction. And this is where the power returns. Not loud, not aggressive, but precise, measured, unshakable. The empath is no longer drowning in other people's emotions. They're standing outside of them, observing, deciding, protecting their energy with a level of awareness they never had before. And it all started with a question most people are too afraid to ask: what is this costing me? Because once that question becomes a habit, self-abandonment becomes impossible. And from that point forward, every interaction is no longer about losing yourself in someone else's world, but about choosing whether they deserve access to yours. There's a lie that sounds noble, and it's been quietly destroying empaths for years. The lie is this: if you're a good person, you should always be there for others. It sounds right. It feels moral. It gets rewarded by society. But biologically, it's a slow form of self-destruction, because the human nervous system was never designed to carry unlimited emotional weight. And yet, that's exactly what an empath tries to do. They absorb tension. They manage other people's moods. They stay present in conversations that drain them long after their body has started signaling distress. At first, those signals are subtle: a tight chest, a slight headache, fatigue that doesn't make sense. But over time, the body gets louder. Sleep becomes inconsistent. Irritability increases. Anxiety shows up without warning. This isn't random. This is the nervous system under pressure. When you're exposed to continuous emotional stress, your body releases cortisol, the primary stress hormone. In short bursts, cortisol is useful. It helps you respond to danger. But when it stays elevated for too long, it starts to damage the body. Research shows that chronically high cortisol levels can impair memory, weaken the immune system, and even increase the risk of heart disease. So when an empath says, "I'm just tired," what they're often experiencing is something deeper. They're dysregulated. Their body is stuck in a state of low-level survival mode, reacting to emotional environments as if they are physical threats. And here's the part that changes everything. The body doesn't care if the threat is real or emotional. Stress is stress, which means every draining conversation, every toxic interaction, every moment of suppressing your own needs is registered by your brain as a cost, a measurable biological cost. Now think about that. Every time an empath chooses someone else's comfort over their own peace, they're not just being kind, they're spending something: mental energy, emotional stability, physical health, and just like any resource, it runs out. This is why emotional burnout doesn't happen overnight. It accumulates, quietly, gradually, until one day the empath doesn't recognize themselves anymore. They feel numb or overwhelmed or disconnected from everything they used to care about. And this is the breaking point where a powerful shift begins. Because the empath starts to realize something that contradicts everything they've been taught: peace is not selfish. Peace is maintenance. It's regulation. It's survival. Choosing peace isn't about rejecting people. It's about protecting the system that allows you to function in the first place. There's a concept in neuroscience called allostatic load. It refers to the cumulative burden of chronic stress on the body. The higher the load, the more wear and tear on your brain and organs. And empaths without boundaries carry one of the highest loads imaginable, not because of what happens to them, but because of what they continuously absorb from others. So when an empath starts setting boundaries, creating distance, limiting exposure to emotional chaos, they're not being cold. They're reducing allostatic load. They're giving their nervous system a chance to reset. And the effects are immediate, even if they're uncomfortable at first. Heart rate stabilizes, breathing becomes deeper, mental clarity begins to return. This is the body recalibrating. This is what healing feels like. But here's the challenge: the brain doesn't instantly recognize peace as safe, especially if it's been conditioned to associate chaos with connection. So when the empath pulls back, when they say no, when they stop responding the way they used to, their system reacts. Guilt surfaces, restlessness appears. There's an urge to go back, to fix, to reconnect, to relieve the tension. This isn't a sign they're doing something wrong. It's a sign that their nervous system is detoxing from overstimulation. And like any detox, it's uncomfortable before it becomes freeing. But if they stay consistent, something remarkable happens. The baseline shifts. What once felt normal, constant emotional noise, pressure, urgency starts to feel overwhelming. And what once felt unfamiliar silence, space, stillness begins to feel safe. This is regulation. This is the nervous system learning that peace is not absence, it's stability. And with that stability comes something the empath has been missing for a long time: energy, real energy. Not the forced kind that comes from pushing through exhaustion, but sustainable energy that comes from alignment, from not constantly overriding your own needs, from not living in a state of emotional reaction. And this energy changes everything. Decision-making improves, focus sharpens, emotional resilience increases. The empath is no longer easily pulled into other people's storms. They can witness without absorbing, care without collapsing, be present without losing themselves. And here's where it becomes powerful, because now their empathy is no longer draining them. It's guided by choice, directed with intention, protected by boundaries. This is what most people misunderstand. They think choosing peace means becoming distant or disconnected, but the opposite is true. When the nervous system is regulated, when the mind is clear, when emotional energy is conserved, the empath can show up more authentically than ever before, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of genuine capacity. And that's the difference between survival-based empathy and healthy empathy. One drains you, the other sustains you. So when an empath chooses peace over people, they're not abandoning others. They're abandoning a pattern that was slowly breaking them. They're stepping out of chronic stress and into conscious control. They're reclaiming their biology, because peace isn't passive. It's an active daily decision to protect your internal state from unnecessary disturbance. And once the body learns what that feels like, there's no going back. Because for the first time, the empath isn't just feeling everything around them, they're finally feeling what it's like to be okay. There's a quiet fear that keeps empaths trapped longer than anything else. The fear of losing people, not conflict, not rejection, loss. Because for most of their lives, connection has been tied to survival. Their identity was built on being needed, being available, being the one who stays when others walk away. So when an empath starts setting boundaries, something inside them panics. It whispers, if you stop giving, they'll leave. And sometimes they do. But here's the truth that changes everything. They were never staying for you. They were staying for access. Access to your attention, your energy, your emotional labor. And the moment that access is restricted, the dynamic shifts. This is not a theory. It's behavioral science. Human relationships often operate on reinforcement patterns. When a behavior consistently produces a reward, it gets repeated. For years, the empath has unknowingly trained people how to treat them. Immediate responses, unlimited availability, emotional support without boundaries. And because there was no cost to taking, people kept taking. But the moment the empath changes the pattern, the reward disappears. And when the reward disappears, so does the behavior. This is why some people pull away the second you stop overgiving. Not because you changed into someone worse, but because you stopped being convenient. And that realization cuts deep, because it forces the empath to confront something painful. Some connections were never built on mutual respect. They were built on imbalance. One person giving, the other receiving, one person adjusting, the other expecting. And when that imbalance is removed, the relationship can't survive in its original form. Now here's where most empaths get it wrong. They interpret this loss as failure. They think maybe I should go back to how I was. But going back doesn't restore connection. It restores dysfunction. Because a relationship that requires you to abandon yourself in order to maintain it is not a relationship. It's a dependency loop. And dependency is not the same as love. In fact, neuroscience shows that relationships built on inconsistent emotional reinforcement, where one person gives unpredictably and the other seeks validation, can create patterns similar to addiction. The brain becomes hooked on approval, on being needed, on the temporary relief that comes from fixing someone else's emotional state. But like any addiction, it comes at a cost: loss of self, loss of clarity, loss of internal stability. So when an empath begins to set boundaries and people start to fall away, what's actually happening is withdrawal, not just for them, but for the people who are benefiting from their overgiving. And withdrawal always reveals the truth. Who respects your limits? Who ignores them? Who disappears when they no longer benefit? This is not loss. This is filtration. A natural separation between those who value you and those who were using you. And as painful as that process is, it creates space. Space that the empath has never had before. Space without constant emotional demands, without pressure to respond, without the invisible weight of other people's expectations. At first, that space feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because the empath is used to noise, to urgency, to being needed. Silence can feel like emptiness when you've been conditioned to equate activity with worth. But something powerful begins to happen in that silence: clarity. Without constant external input, the brain finally has the capacity to process internal signals. Thoughts become more organized. Emotions become easier to identify. Decisions become less reactive and more intentional. This is cognitive recovery. This is what happens when the mind is no longer overloaded. And from this clarity, a new identity begins to form. Not the identity shaped by other people's needs, but one rooted in self-awareness. The empath starts to recognize their own preferences, their own limits, their own emotional patterns. And for the first time, they can differentiate between what they feel and what they've been absorbing. That distinction is life-changing, because now they're no longer reacting to everything. They're choosing who to engage with, choosing when to step back, choosing what deserves their energy. And with that choice comes stability, emotional stability that doesn't fluctuate based on who's around them, a sense of self that isn't dependent on being needed. This is where healthier relationships begin to emerge. Not the ones built on urgency or imbalance, but ones built on mutual respect, where communication doesn't feel like obligation, where support flows both ways, where boundaries are not challenged, but understood. Psychological research consistently shows that relationships with clear, respected boundaries lead to higher levels of trust, lower stress, and greater long-term satisfaction, because boundaries don't push people away. They define how people can stay. And the ones who are meant to stay adapt. They respect the shift. They value the change. They meet you at a level that doesn't require self-sacrifice. These are not louder relationships. They're quieter, more stable, more predictable, more real. And perhaps for the first time, the empath feels safe inside a connection, not anxious, not overextended. We're safe, but the most profound transformation isn't in how they relate to others, it's in how they relate to themselves. Because when the noise fades and the chaos disappears, there's finally room to meet the person who's been neglected the longest, themselves. Not the version that constantly gives, not the version that adapts to keep others comfortable, but the version that exists without pressure, without performance, without the need to earn connection. And in that space, something unexpected happens. They realize they're not empty without others. They're peaceful,
Whole.
complete in a way that doesn't require constant validation. And that realization changes the way they move through the world. They no longer chase connection. They attract alignment. They no longer over-explain. They communicate clearly and step back when needed. They no longer fear losing people because they understand that losing what was draining them is how they found themselves. So when an empath chooses peace over people, they're not becoming distant. They're becoming defined. Defined by what they allow, what they tolerate, what they protect. And in that definition, they don't just change their relationships. They transform their entire reality. Because the moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep others is the moment everything false begins to fall away and everything real finally has space to stay.